Hey, it's Justin Harvey. Thanks for tuning in to the Anesthesia and Pain Management Success podcast. With APM Success, we take a close look at important topics pertaining to business, practice management, personal finance, and careers for anesthesiologists and pain management physicians. We work hard to take your critical questions straight to the experts. Thanks for listening. This week I had a great conversation with Dr. Brian Schmutzler. We covered the topic of anesthesia consolidation from a little bit of a different perspective, what we might call a contrarian view. Dr. Schmutzler thinks that it's not actually the foregone conclusion that we've been hearing from many quarters, and in fact there may be just renewed space for independent physician practice in the specialty of anesthesiology going forward. He has lots of really interesting rationale for this. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hello and welcome to episode 84 of APM Success. I'm very pleased to be joined with a returning guest, Dr. Brian Schmutzler, who joined us back in the early 30s as far as the episode number, and he was sharing a little bit about his career journey in the anesthesiology world, working in private practice, academics, and ultimately starting his own anesthesia company and doing consulting. He's one of these super smart guys that I really value his opinion, his industry perspective. He perceives what's going on out there, and he's here to share some of his thoughts with us today. Dr. Schmutzler, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me again.
The topic for today, and this is what I will call a contrarian perspective based on a lot of the conversations I've had recently, even on this show, is thinking about industry consolidation, specifically in anesthesia, and is it the foregone conclusion that we are told? And before we dive into that, which is going to be a fun and a little bit of a technical topic, why don't you just tell us kind of what's going on? What's your current practice look like? How has COVID impacted you? And what's going on right now in 2021?
Sure, absolutely. 2021's brought a couple of transitions for me. I went from just running a surgery center to taking over the anesthesia at a physician-owned hospital. And so I've kind of moved away from some of that other clinical stuff at the surgery center. I'm still kind of dealing with that administratively, but primarily spending my clinical time at a physician-owned hospital. And we can go to that story sometime, but a bunch of guys I knew from town kind of got together and bought a hospital. So enjoying doing that right now and improving the anesthesia there. In terms of COVID from 2020, what happened through COVID 2020 with us. I'm in Indiana, which we may have discussed before, and here we had about 6 weeks of COVID shutdown where we were not permitted to do truly elective procedures. Now the surgery center where I was running the anesthesia, we did a fair amount of sort of kidney stone type procedures, cancer procedures, that sort of stuff. So we had several procedures where we continued to do some of that non-emergent but also non-elective surgeries, which again, I've said before, I think we did the right thing for the patients and the right thing for the center. So,
did you find that in that context, everyone had the same definition of what elective was?
No, absolutely not. Every surgeon thinks their procedure is urgent or emergent. So, no, I mean there are things that are clearly elective surgeries. Cosmetic surgeries are clearly elective. Screening colonoscopies, for the most part, are elective, that sort of stuff. So, we didn't skate the line there at all. But having a tumor taken out, whether that's a tumor in the gallbladder, a tumor in the abdomen, a tumor in the breast, something like that, that's clearly not a truly elective surgery. A stone in the kidneys or the ureter, that's not an elective surgery. So we were pretty good about, we kind of had a panel, the medical director of the surgery center, myself, and then the CEO of the surgery center all sat down and went through all those cases for that 6 weeks and made sure that we were obeying the laws of Indiana and the executive orders, but also doing the right thing by the patient.
Yeah. And just for our listeners' understanding, what does your anesthesia company look like as far as clinicians involved in care?
So at the surgery center, we have one doc and 3 or 4 CRNAs, kind of depending on the day. A few other sites we have are it's basically 2 to 1 doc to CRNA or CRNA to doc ratio. So two CRNAs for every doc, pretty much every location we have. Here at the physician-owned hospital where we just started, it's 1.5 full-time docs. I'm one of them, and then we have a 0.6 FTE doc, and then 4 CRNAs. So we do a care team model, mostly supervision, meaning the anesthesiologist is involved in the care of all the patients, but not necessarily directly directing. That makes sense.
Yeah, we're going to do a separate episode on that.
Supervision versus direction. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And then as far as 2021, I've been hearing stories, obviously April, May were very slow, and then things have ramped back up. And then towards the end of the year here, I was reading Tony Mira, Anesthesia Business Consultants, has a great newsletter that he puts out periodically. And he was saying, the consensus is that people are running like 100 to 110% right now as far as OR capacity. And I've heard reports that say that may go until mid 2022 just to get caught up. So what are you seeing on the ground right now?
Yeah, so the 6 weeks, I'd say for the whole 6 weeks, we probably were at about 20 to 30% capacity. And I think, I can say May 4th was the date we were allowed. I think it was May 4th was the date we were allowed to go back to it. We had about a week of 50%, 2 weeks of 75%. And then the rest of the year, we were 100 to 150%. Of what we normally do. I didn't go back and look how we ended up the entire year. I think it was pretty close, within 10% of what a normal year is at the surgery center. I can tell you that the surgery center has continued at, we kind of averaged around 85 to 90 cases a week at that particular surgery center. And I've been kind of following along. It's about 110 to 115 for January and the first week of February. Same here at the physician-owned hospital. Third and fourth quarter were crazy. Just looking back at some of the data, and we've been running pretty, at least compared to. It's a little hard to compare because they weren't fully up and going in January, February of 2020. But we're running pretty heavy in terms of the number of cases. So I think that there's a lot of pent up demand. There's still some patients out there who are afraid to have surgery because of COVID, but there's some pent up demand, and that pent up demand I think will continue for quite some time.
Are you having to make any staffing changes to accommodate this increased volume?
Yeah, I personally keep a cadre of PRN, CRNAs in every area that I have contracts, and so I'd say we're probably running about a half FTE over what we predicted at most places that we have contracts. So I'm calling up and saying, hey, can you work Thursday? Can you work Friday? Can you work next Tuesday? But we've been okay. We're not at the point. There's a break point, and sometimes that's 500 cases, sometimes that's 600 cases, depending on the facility. There's a break point of hiring another staff, and so we're not quite to the point where we're hiring another staff, but we're certainly using a lot of PRNs.
Yeah. And one of the things that we've seen, obviously, in the last year with this, shock to the system that COVID has been, is the anesthesia landscape, which was already constantly evolving, has been accelerated in certain ways. And some of that has to do with, it has to do with a lot of things. So tell us what you've seen in the last year and how you've interpreted what you've seen.
Sure. A lot of movement, certainly. And there was even a lot of movement prior to COVID. A lot of the large anesthesia groups either merged, and we kind of talked about this before with, number one and number two in the anesthesia world had a merger acquisition. Kind of depends which side you listen to. And then some of the private equity and venture capital backed large anesthesia groups had some financial difficulties, leading to some issues with staffing, with contracts, and obviously with cash flow. So, I think we've talked about this before, that the general consensus across the ASA, across anesthesia groups and around the country is consolidation. And I think that may have started 2020, but as COVID hit and as more and more things got exposed, I think that consolidation has really led to exposure of a lot of issues in the anesthesia world, and that consolidation has slowed and even in some cases reversed, depending on what market you're in.
Yeah, depending on who you talk to, you feel like the unstoppable force of industry consolidation. I'm picturing Indiana Jones like running through the Temple of Doom with that huge boulder like rolling behind him, and like there's no stopping it. But it seems that the evidence that we've seen in 2020 has been that it's not that simple. And in fact, there are some forces, as you noted, that could be pushing more towards physician-owned or independent practice.
Yeah, I think a lot of these large companies and a lot of venture capital has gotten scared away by the risk that they didn't know existed prior to 2020. You and I have talked before. Who would have ever thought that as a CRNA or an anesthesiologist, you would be without a job, or furloughed or fired, or your production or your salary reduced. And so I think a lot of this risk that most of these companies didn't think existed, or at least kind of pushed under the table a little bit, came out in full force during COVID. And so I think there's been a big step back from venture capital, private equity, and even from mergers and acquisitions because of this risk that's now obviously much more to the forefront.
Yeah. And so with private equity and venture capital, I can't remember. I know we've talked about this in the show, but I want to just briefly kind of rehash the basics just for our listeners. So private equity is the opposite of public equity, which is like the S&P 500, a publicly traded company, trades on a stock exchange. You can buy a share of GameStop, for instance, if you want to, and own that and sell it. And it's very liquid, very easy to buy. And as such, the expected return, the money you expect to make on a publicly traded company is, in general, a little bit less because everyone has access to the same information all the time. Buying and selling happens in real time. With private equity, it's not like publicly traded. It's I and my rich friends, or a consortium of investors, we go and we buy a company where we think there's unique business opportunity, an opportunity to exploit, to make extra money above and beyond what the market perceives, because it's not publicly traded and we're doing extra research that people don't know about, and we have maybe an inside track. And so the way that public equity has perceived, this is a gross oversimplification, but the way that they've perceived specifically anesthesia, and there was a JAMA article a little while ago that looked at PE acquisitions through 2012 to 2015. We'll try to link to it in the show notes if I can dig it up, that concluded that anesthesiologists were the most acquired specialty by private equity, including all the multi-specialty groups that PE had bought into. So it's an area of particular interest. And so these private equity guys, these smart dudes with their little think tanks doing the research that they're doing, they look at anesthesia and they say, it seems like there's an opportunity here to make some money that isn't publicly sort of perceived or known. And so there's an opportunity for investment. And so my 2 cents on sort of what has happened in this last year, Dr. Schmutzler, I'd love for you to weigh in on this as well, is just that there were unaccounted for risks. There was a big return expectation, and that was great, and things were probably going just fine until the big thing happened that no one could have possibly foreseen, that not only hit private equity markets, but hit public markets as well. If you look at what happened between middle of February and end of March, it was a massive crisis. We didn't know, is this the Black Death 2.0? And obviously things leveled out eventually, but in the process, these PE funds that had to pay significant, dividends, returns to their investors, they found that by the time they paid people and kept everybody happy, they didn't have enough money to have it continue to make sense to hold, these companies that were now had a lot of risk built into them, a lot of downside that wasn't initially perceived. So all of that is to say, private equity, I think, is perhaps evolving a little bit in the way that they look at the specialty. And obviously, we don't think necessarily that another COVID is going to happen in the same way, but there's always that risk of something happening. And perhaps it has muted some of the enthusiasm that we've seen in this specialty in particular. That's kind of what I think and how I've interpreted the last 12 months. What do you think?
I think the fundamentals of anesthesia haven't changed. So you've got a lot of anesthesia companies or anesthesia groups who run very fat, who don't run well in terms of their financials. And I think there's a big opportunity there for private equity. So that's one reason they buy in. The other reason they buy in is there's zero overhead. We as anesthesiologists, as anesthesia providers, we don't own our own machines, we don't own our own building, we don't have our own, secretaries and all that sort of stuff. We're very low on overhead costs, almost zero on overhead costs. So essentially, what you're buying is a set of employees and some contracts. So I think the fundamentals still make sense for private equity. I think what private equity and none of us ever really thought would happen is that risk would come in. Who would have ever thought that all elective surgeries had to be canceled at a national level. And I think this is a pendulum that happens in any industry. Private equity buys in, private equity buys in, private equity buys in, and then something happens. The dot-com bubble, the Silicon Valley bubble of the early 2000s. There's all kinds of kind of bubbles that happen, and all that really means is that nobody took into account the actual risk.
Yeah, and I think another element of this is sort of the legislative risk, and I'm curious to talk about sort of how it relates to consolidation. But I think that if with a Democratic White House, Senate, and House, the potential for whatever single payer or Medicare for all ends up looking like for a specialty that reimburses 30% of Medicare rates. We don't know exactly how it's going to appear, but on face value, that doesn't seem to be good news for the profitability of the specialty. I mean, I'm just guessing here. So perhaps there's other factors at play that are influencing the way that these opportunities are perceived.
That's possible. And I think you and I have talked about this briefly before, and then you've had entire shows on the reimbursement in anesthesia and how it's reimbursed as ASA units. We as anesthesia providers, particularly anesthesiologists in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, took about a 90% pay cut when we came to the AMA table to talk about, Medicare reimbursement. And for those of you who don't know, there's a pie that Medicare has out there, and we, as all the medical specialties, get to split that pie. And whoever kind of makes the most noise and does the best negotiating at these AMA meetings gets their pie either increased or decreased depending on what everybody says. So we took a huge cut in the late 80s, early 90s, and so Medicare rates for anesthesia providers are not good. Very, very low as compared to other industries or other areas in medicine. Medicare rates might be half to two-thirds of what your private payer rates are. In anesthesia, it's a fifth, at best a half of what your rates are with your private payers. So, and to compensate for that, essentially what hospitals do is they pay a stipend or they pay a guarantee to anesthesia groups or whoever comes in and does their anesthesia to say, hey, we have to have you. We have to do surgery. This is where we make all our money. 80% of the hospital's money comes out of the operating room. But we can't do that without anesthesia, and we can't pay anesthesia providers at the rates that Medicare, Medicaid, and even some of the private payers pay us. So what do? Well, we take some of that money that we get from our surgeries and we kind of pump it back into that anesthesia group. So, yes, if we go to Medicare for all, do I think we're all going to take a pay cut? Probably. But do I think we're going to go to what the true value of that Medicare ASA unit is? No, it's not going to happen. The hospitals are still going to have to pump it.
It makes sense because you need both a surgeon and an anesthesiologist to do a surgery. At least any kind of surgery I would want to be a part of as a patient. So you talked about overhead, and I think this is a great point. And I've talked to other, friends who have pointed out this phenomenon of a physician-owned practice perhaps having, if you get 10 anesthesiologists together who have a contract at the hospital, they don't need even office space really. It's so streamlined, and that can make their bid very competitive, even if it's, physician only and perhaps it's a different sort of care model. And so talk about the overhead component and how that relates to the private equity conversation and the different dynamics there.
Yeah, so if you look at most surgical specialties, which is where a lot of money is, that are at least procedural-based specialties, private equity is not going out and buying family practice docs, pediatricians, that sort of stuff. They're going out and buying hematology oncology docs. They're buying surgeons, particularly orthopedic and spine surgeons. So they're buying up areas of medicine where there's money to be made. All those areas, those surgical specialties, have somewhere in general, and I'm not involved in a ton of these conversations, but I just kind of know from what I hear at meetings and talking to people, somewhere between 60 and 80% overhead. So they, if you collect $1 million, you're really only taking home $200,000 to $400,000 because that other chunk is going to your overhead. That's paying staff, that's paying, for buildings and for office space and all that kind of stuff. In anesthesia, really our only overhead is billing. You gotta pay somebody to do your billing. Either in-house, you're paying a particular person, or you're paying a company to do your billing. And that ranges, but it's nowhere near 60 to 80%. And then often, if you're in a large private practice group, somebody will take some percentage of that to run the group, or if you are part of national group, that national group is going to take anywhere from 10 to 30% off the top as overhead. So when you talk about overhead, we as anesthesia have almost none. And again, private equity comes in and they say, hey, you've got all these providers, you've got these contracts. It's not like we're looking at, okay, you do $2 million in revenue for a year per year, but you have to pay 8 million in overhead. It's 10 million, and that's the 10 million we got. And if we streamline it, we might make it 12 or 15. We're still not paying any overhead.
So talk a little bit about, so there's the overhead component as a differentiator or a reason that perhaps we should be excited about the future of independent practice, or at least not as down on it as some others are. Are there other, as you think about yourself and your own practice, you're obviously, you started an anesthesia company, you have some employees, you've got some contracts. I'm sure you work hard to maintain those contracts, to make sure the hospital, the surgeons are happy, the executives running the hospital, that you know them and they know you, and there's an accountability there at the surgery center. People start on time. You probably, you're aware of these things. So tell me about, how do you as an independent practice owner insulate protect that relationship, protect the contract, to make sure that everyone's very happy and that you're not in danger of, being dislodged?
Yeah. So it comes down to two big things: service and money. Okay. So, if you can streamline your practice and keep it inexpensive. So again, either zero cost or minimal cost, or, occasionally you can even, by kind of default, help the surgeons make more money because you're bringing in more cases, tougher cases, your turnover times are less. And so, everybody's doing better. So money is the big thing. That's what drives a lot of people. So you definitely have to be on the lower end of the cost. You don't have to be the lowest cost, but you got to be the lower end of the cost. And then service, right? That most of the places that I service, the surgeons own the facility. So they want everything to run great. They want to come like it's their house, right? They go to these big hospitals and they're sort of like a guest at the big hospitals. But when they come back to their surgery center or their hospital, they want to feel like they're at home. And so, always being available, or having maybe even a little bit extra staff available to get them into a room, that's very helpful. Having those conversations that, they know all of the surgeons and all of the sort of C-suite people or administrative people at all the places that I have contracts know that they can call me anytime. So I was in a foreign country, I won't mention where, on vacation last week, and I spent, probably 30% of the time on the phone, which is fine. I don't mind. And they're usually simple questions. Hey, this person wants to get a case on, but there's no room. How do we want to do that? And really just being flexible, but understanding that anesthesia is a service industry, more so than anything else. We don't have our own patients. Surgeons bring patients to us. And so in return, we need to make sure that we are doing the best thing for the patients, but also really acting like a service industry to the surgeons.
It seems like a fellowship in OR diplomacy would be time well spent for somebody, if that was even an option. How did you learn all these soft skills that are so critical?
So I had a little bit of business background, even through college and before, did a few different things. And just sort of, part of it is innate, and part of it is just learning from other people, but sort of being able to read people, being able to understand what people want. And I had a few mentors, both through college and through residency, medical school and residency, who I just sort of try to pattern myself after, just so that I'm able to, I'm not, the best things that we do as anesthesia providers is to help the surgeon come to their own conclusion of why something should happen, why a case should be canceled, why a patient should be done at a hospital, not a surgery center, and that sort of stuff. So I think really it's just kind of reading people and knowing how to sort of softly bring up things and to help them kind of think through it themselves. It's almost like, and hopefully no surgeons are listening, but it's almost like with my kids. I've got a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old. If I can make them make the decision themselves, they're going to love, eating their broccoli or going to bed early or something like that. But if I just say, I need you to go to bed right now, it just doesn't work. So I don't know, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually like I think a pretty fundamental like behavioral psychology tenet. And I use the same thing in financial planning. I can tell somebody what I think they should do, but it's way better if I present them with a set of facts that could potentially inform a certain course of action and allow them to draw that conclusion themselves. That solidifies it and allows it to, take root in a much more effective manner, I've
Yeah,
observed.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So let's kind of bring it to a close here. Tell me about, as 2021 is hopefully going to be a very busy and productive year for everyone. And hopefully, we're seeing new case volume continue to drop and hospital capacity seems like it's doing okay across the board. Who's positioned to succeed and to thrive in an environment where things are getting really busy? Is it basically like the rising tide raises all ships? And if you're in anesthesia and you've made it this far, you're basically going to be okay because you're in the clear?
I think it's kind of what kind of commitments do you have? So how much money are you owing to people? And this is a private equity and venture capital issue. And then sort of how are your contracts run and how much overhead do you have? So I think the people who are really positioned to do well, medium to large size private practice groups who stay pretty lean and have good contracts and good relationships in their contracts. That's probably number one. Number two, smaller national anesthesia companies that, there's a whole crop of them that have come up now. And I work with one in particular that I love. And again, we're not talking any names here, but if you look me up, you'll figure out who that is. So these companies sort of decentralize everything. They don't have a big office. They don't have 4 CEOs and 15 COOs and that sort of thing. So these smaller national companies that they keep overhead very low, I think are going to do quite well, picking off contracts from the bigger anesthesia companies and the venture capital and PE-backed companies. But I think everybody's probably going to do fairly well, pending some sort of additional crisis or Medicare for all or something like that. But I think everybody in anesthesia is going to do well. It's just how much did 2020 really affect the bottom line for some of these companies? But I think we'll all be okay. I just think that it's going to shift things kind of away from this big consolidation and back to sort of a smaller anesthesia group model.
One thing you touched on, and I'd love to try to unpack it briefly before we wrap up, is just because it's so interesting and important, and it's a little bit technical, but maybe you could keep it high level enough for us to be able to understand. The group contract dynamic, in different environments, can you maybe give a couple examples of what are some types of contracts, for example, that you or one of your peers who's an anesthesia company owner or one of the bigger companies might have with a hospital? And what does that mean in COVID? Like who bears the brunt of the losses? Who enjoys the upside? And then in a year like 2021, similarly, like what are some of the ways that those deals can be struck? And what are the implications for the people who are running the anesthesia?
Well, there's several different ways to set up a contract with either a surgery center or a hospital. Probably the large anesthesia companies, and again, we won't name any names, but there's a couple in particular, large anesthesia companies will come in and pitch a contract. Hey, the hospital, I need you to pay me $3 million up front. I'll fix the anesthesia, and then after that, I take the risk. So if we don't produce, then I'm losing. If we do produce, I gain. But you paid me up front, and so they take all their money up front, stick it away, take it to their next contract, pay their shareholders, however they do it. So that's one way to do it. I think that is probably not the best way to do it because then you bear all the risk. So you've spent that $3 million, and now you have 0 elective cases and are making 0 money. And a lot of those companies ended up having to furlough or fire or lay off a number of anesthesia providers. And I think we talked before that somewhere in the range of 70 to 80% of 1099 anesthesia providers were furloughed during COVID. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to just set up a guarantee with the hospital, which says this year we will make $10 million. If you bring us cases and we collect $10 million, you owe us 0. If you bring cases and we make $12 million, you owe us 0, and we get to keep $2 million additional. So great for everybody. If you only bring us $7 million in cases, you owe us $3 million to make up the loss. I think that's more of a shared risk model. A little bit more risk on the hospital end, but a little bit more shared risk model, which seems to work fairly well for larger groups, larger hospitals. And then there's always the no guarantee. We each take our own risk. And, so we're going to take what we collect, but at the same time, we don't really owe you anything. So you want 10 providers, that's fine if you have 10 rooms worth of work. But if you have 4 rooms worth of work, you're getting 4 rooms worth of providers. And if you want more, you have to pay for it. So that seems to work pretty well if the hospital is smaller location or even a surgery center where they don't necessarily need somebody sitting around all day long waiting for a case to come in. So I mean, those are kind of the ways that you can run anesthesia in terms of contracts with facilities. I stay away from the asking for a bunch of money up front and then taking all the risk. I'd say the majority of our other contracts are one of the other 2 ways that I described. But there's still risk in it. If COVID happens again, I'm still going to lose money, and the hospital likely to lose money as well. But at least we're not one-sided losing money on that. Was that kind of answering what you were asking?
Yeah, I think so. That's helpful context. So I'm talking to a few people right now who are sort of kicking the tires on various jobs. Many actually, I mean, a lot of people have already sort of signed for this coming summer if you're just finishing residency or fellowship. But for people who are looking at, practice A, practice B, are there any of these dynamics that should inform the way that they're thinking about or looking at either financial viability or employment, like durability or upside or anything like that? Or is it more like for the the executives to worry about or the practice owners and not as much for employees?
If you're taking a job anywhere, particularly out of residency, there's a lot of things you want to look at with a job. So stability, right? How long has the group been around? Are they losing contracts, gaining contracts, or staying the same? And honestly, losing or gaining, either way, if it's too fast, it's a problem, right? You don't want to be expanding faster than you have staff, because then you're going to end up covering post-call some random surgery center somewhere. And so you really want to look at stability of the group. You want to look at, as much as they'll let you have it, and a lot of times they won't let a non-partner have it, but you want to look at profit and loss statements. You want to look at, find out how much does each partner get paid? How much does each non-partner get paid? How does that work? How do I get paid? And so there's a lot of questions you want to ask there. But if they'll give you a profit and loss statement for the last 3 or 4 years, that's great. I'd look at that personally. But a lot of times they won't do that. And then, this is something I think you and I are going to talk about a little bit later on, kind of in another podcast, but non-competes, right? How stringent is the non-compete? How fair is the non-compete? How enforceable is the non-compete? And is there a non-compete? I personally don't sign non-competes anymore. And again, this is a conversation we can have in a broader context. But, those are things that I definitely look at anytime you go in to try to take a position, coming right out of residency, even mid-career or late career. And then always the question of, are you a W-2 employee or a 1099? What does that mean? How much flexibility do you have and that sort of stuff? So, but if you're really digging in and trying to find which practice is right for me, stability and profit and loss.
Great. Well, Dr. Brian Schmutzler, as always, it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on Anesthesia and Pain Management Success.
My pleasure.
If you liked what you heard this week, head on over to apmsuccess.com, where you can find more content and free resources to help you build a successful career in anesthesia and pain management. If you wanted to leave a review in iTunes, I'd also really appreciate it. Thanks for using some of your valuable time to join me today on APM Success.